Hello, I'm Dr. William E. Morgan of Parker University here in Dallas, Texas. And today we're going to have a special service announcement talking about Achilles tendon ruptures following the COVID lockdown. And with me today, I have some special guests. We have Dr. Katie Pohlman, PhD, DC, and the director of our research department here at Parker University. And we have Dr. Nicky Kirk, a clinician coming down from Synapse Human Performance Centers. And joining us remotely is Dr. MaryAnne Dimak, who's our Director of Strength and Human Performance here at Parker University. So thank you all for joining us today. And to put this in perspective, when our students returned to campus after isolating for the COVID-19 pandemic, we noticed an uptick in the number of Achilles tendon ruptures. And we had some outdoor sports and people were concerned whether that might have been part of the problem. But as we looked at this, and we had about a half dozen cases which occurred, and I started researching into that. And one of our quality assurance projects is to embrace evidence in our decision making. I found that there were studies showing that there's an uptick in Achilles tendon ruptures in Japan, in Australia, in Germany, and in the United States. So that it was not just something that was happening here, it was something happening globally. And as we looked at this, we've looked at sport surfaces and the different factors that have contributed to this. But essentially it comes down to this: is we have a world that's been isolated and deconditioned for 2 years, suddenly trying to return back to their same level of activity, and their bodies weren't prepared for that. So, I've got these experts here with me today on strength and human performance, and I'd just like to engage them in a conversation about that. So, Dr. Kirk, you've looked at a lot of the research. You've really been diving into this for the last several days. What are some of the things that this evidence is showing us?
What we're seeing and what's been interesting, maybe there's things here which we were already aware of but hadn't been exposed to, is that load management, that is the exposure that these individuals have to sport and activity as they ramp up, needs to be fairly well controlled, because as the load exposure starts to become more chaotic, the exercise becomes a little less predictable. And what we start to see are injuries occurring that maybe wouldn't have happened previously, because now they're doing activities which their body's simply not conditioned to do. So that would be number one. As Dr. Pohlman had pointed out earlier, the average weight gain during the pandemic was 30 pounds. That may be slightly different in Texas because of the duration of our lockdown, but nonetheless, that also has an impact on the ability of our tissues in the body to withstand load and the demands of sport and activity. And to give it a frame, something like an Achilles tendon rupture, that can entail 9 to 12 months of recovery time, which creates it's a big burden for an individual. We have to have empathy for the people who've had it. But through the Performance Center, we're always trying to encourage exercise as a form of medicine. It starts to impact quality of life in a number of other ways. So we really concern ourselves then with people returning to sport and returning safely.
So you said something interesting there. Dr. Pohlman was the one who brought this up, that the average American gained 30 pounds during the COVID lockdown, which moves us towards something called metabolic disease or prediabetes or central obesity. We were also, even before this happened, there were studies showing that a degradation of the tissue of the Achilles tendon, which was affiliated with these metabolic disease processes of central obesity, kind of predictive of other things going on. So the combination of inactivity, staying at home, and as I said, with your feet kind of pointed downward in what we call plantar flexion most of the day, and then you go out and play a sport like basketball, is where we're seeing a lot of these ruptures, and in a degraded tissue, it's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, and these tissues, the tendons require something called stiffness. And usually when we think about stiffness in the human body, we don't think of it as a positive thing necessarily. But these tissues, tendons in particular, they need to be able to absorb the stresses. So as we take a step, the tendon needs to absorb the force, and then they need to explode back to return that energy when we take a step, when we run, when we jump. It's an important part of the human body being efficient. If we have some of those pre-existing conditions, such as poorly controlled blood sugar, we may be suffering from prediabetes or any number of conditions like that, that can start to affect the integrity, the quality of the tissue in the tendon, which then decreases the stiffness and then decreases the tendon's ability to function, predisposing it to tears and breakdown.
Well, how does inflammation or even infection affect tendons? Are they more brittle?
More brittle, yeah.
So you're more likely, even if you're inflamed, so if you really shouldn't play sick. So Dr. Dimak, who you're joining us remotely, I know you love this phrase, it's not the load that breaks us, it's the load you're unprepared for. Can you kind of elaborate on what are some of the things we're seeing that the cause of this uptick in tendon ruptures and some of the things that our home audience could do to prevent this injury from happening to them?
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you for using the Tim Gabbett quote. It's one of the underlying principles that we have within our programs here at Parker, especially the Strength and Human Performance Master's Program, where we're really working with students to develop the skills to be able to have this discussion and how to serve their populations. So for the general public, what really this comes down to is it's not the basketball that's the problem. It's not the deadlift or the squat as a workout. It's not the load. It's the load that your body is not prepared for. So it's a bit of a reflective principle here to say, am I ready for this activity today? And we have activities that we choose to do, and then we have activities that we have to do. And our job as healthcare practitioners is to help people identify the potential loads and the potential deficiencies they have in their body's ability to withstand the pressures and the loads of their day-to-day tasks. And so what this includes is movement. It includes, people getting moving, increasing overall activity level. Of course, there should be a ramping process depending on how, sedentary someone has been. But it's getting a good quality strength and conditioning program. And that strength and conditioning program needs to have some of those fundamental principles that we teach, and that's making sure that it has a person-specific intervention for the activities of their life.
Now, as we've been really pouring through the literature the last few days, we find there's certain things that you've been linked to behavior that you can address, and other things you can't. So what does the literature say about surfaces and Achilles tendon ruptures? Courts, grasses, astroturf, things like that?
I think it's somewhat inconclusive. The only thing we can say is that we know that different types of surfaces versus different types of shoes, they change the amount of traction and therefore where some of that force goes. But the key thing is that the type of surface that you're going to be doing your sport on, whether it's a running track, whether it's a basketball court, whether it's an indoor wooden court, is going to have a specific shoe which is going to work best for that. And they tend not to be transferable very well across surfaces, much less when you're going to be exposing your body to high velocities and change of direction.
What would you recommend as far as minimalist shoes, which are very popular now, and playing agility sports with those?
Well, they have their place, but probably not in agility sport. So again, I'd be selecting something which provides me the most comfort at the expense maybe of a little bit of performance or grip.
Now, minimalist shoes are shoes that have very little support, and the heel is pretty low, so you're already putting that tendon under stress. How about running shoes? Would that be a good idea to play basketball or tennis with a running shoe?
So again, they're not really designed for that. The way that they're designed is for linear motion. Mm-hmm. They're not really designed for the sudden change of direction. So you may recall last year that in a high-profile basketball game, because of the high traction of the shoe, that he actually tore the shoe. Such was the force of the change of direction. So we think about the types of forces that are going through those shoes which were specifically designed for that individual. And then we want to pick up the shoe that we wear for gardening or the shoe that we wear for walking the dog and then go out onto a basketball court. Maybe it's not a surprise that we don't get the support that we need.
So one of the things I saw in the Cochrane Systematic Review site was, after reviewing tons of different studies, they found that there's really only 3 things they can point to that we have control over. Alcohol consumption. They found that people who have moderate to heavy drinking are much more likely to have an Achilles tendon rupture. Taking a drug called, I don't want to name the brand name, but a fluoroquinolone, which is a drug that's used for bacterial infections, and also plantar flexion strength, basically the strength, the ability to do weighted toe raises. Those are the things you have control over. Other things like the surface that you're playing on, a lot less research on, or when you say inconclusive, they didn't have any substantial evidence to support that. So keeping fit, avoiding the drugs and alcohol are things that we can do to prevent that. But also, I think, and Dr. Dimak will talk about this a little bit, is conditioning. We really need to make sure you have a slow, gradual return to activities, and we want to make sure that we share this information with everybody. This problem is complex and multifactorial, but it really talks a lot about tissue quality of the tendon.
Yeah, and the strength we need to build up in order to be able to perform explosive sports and activities. So we know that even when we walk, the strength of the calf and the gastrocs, that's the calf muscles, they require that's a 4x body weight load.
So that's 4 times your body weight.
4 times your body weight every step going through the calf. We also know, and these are average numbers, that sub-maximal, so not even your strongest effort of pogo jumps or hops, is in excess of 8 times your body weight every single time. So now you multiply that by the number of steps you take or the number of times you jump, and then you consider, have I actually adequately prepared myself for even more than 10 minutes of this activity, let alone an hour when we're fatigued?
So to put that in perspective, a 200-pound man would have to do 1,600 pounds of calf raises to equate the stresses that are being put on that calf during agility activities.
Repetitively, because they're not going to do it just once.
So there's a lot of stress here. So you need to be prepared. You can't go from being sedentary for 2 years and to return to your level of sports. Before the COVID outbreak, the mechanism of injury was usually a 40, or the most common person who would be injured would be a 40-year-old man who was sedentary and wanted to return to playing basketball and go out, and that would happen. We've moved that to the left. Now it's a 25-year-old who's been sitting on the couch for 2 years, and they're going out, and they're seeing the same, basically, we've moved the same mechanism to the left. So, Dr. Pohlman, we've been talking a lot about, looking at a lot of research. What do you have to say about where we're going with this, and what should our next steps be?
Yeah, so when we've identified a series of unprecedented cases, the best next step for a rare condition is an observational study. There's 3 types of observational. One is just cross-sectional, what's happening right now. Or you can have an exposure and follow that forward. That's a cohort. What we have is the outcome, and we're going to assess it backwards to look at outcome measures. And we do have a small group of cases that we're going to look at. So we know that with observational studies, you can only identify associations or trends. There's no causation here, but if we can look at associations and put it out in the literature, that can help the academic community gather more data on this topic, which is all of our responsibility at an academic institution, and helpful. It's how they identified that it was 40-year-olds, their muscles fatigued, was the initial incidence or risk factors for Achilles tendon, and we're going to see, has that changed?
So there's a lot of jargon in there. So putting it into plain English, we're going to basically research. We know there's limitations to the research, but we want to add to the body of knowledge and find out some of the factors that may contribute to this phenomenon.
Nailed it.
And we're also interested in getting something called shear wave elastography, which is uniquely designed to measure the tissue integrity of the Achilles tendon, and possibly even be prophylactically the likelihood of injuries. Can you talk a little bit more about that, or either of you?
Yeah, so from my standpoint, we want, when I'm looking at cases and controls, I want to look at the quality of tendons to see if there's any difference. The shear wave elastography is the gold standard for that. So we will make sure we're using the gold standard.
And if we were able to implement that up to Synapse Human Performance Center, how would you utilize it as a clinician, Dr.
Yeah,
Kirk?
a great tool, because then it allows us to give an insight. We'd mentioned previously that there typically aren't, sometimes somebody will develop an Achilles, what they call a tendinopathy, which means they'll have a kind of constant ongoing ache in the Achilles tendon in the back of the calf when they do activities. Sometimes that can be a precursor to a full rupture of the tendon, but sometimes not. Either way, it'll give us the opportunity and the ability to actually have a look at that tendon prophylactically before they develop a more catastrophic issue and start to manage these problems up front. But additionally, And what's exciting about it is if we're working with a developmental athlete or somebody who's aspiring to play sport at a higher level, we can actually start to look at the impact of our programs on the development of the tissues that we know that they'll need in order to perform at that level, because there are benchmarks for that. So a tool that we would be able to really bring a lot to the clients and patients we work with.
I know you work with a lot of elite athletes. I would imagine you would use that as screening and, as part of their preparing for play. And certainly it sounds like it'd be a good idea to be using this as we return to normal activities after COVID. Now, I'm going to go to Dr. Dimak, who again, our Director of Strength and Human Performance. So I would like you to share some practical ideas for a home audience, somebody who's been relatively sedentary but would like to go back to playing tennis or basketball. So time frames and what are some of the things they should do to gradate their return to play?
Absolutely. So from a strength and human performance perspective, when we have incidents like this, it just can help us shed light on things that we know that we can do to just honestly put the best product out onto the field that has the highest, resiliency to hopefully prevent injury. And part of that includes having a baseline and understanding what level you're at, and then building that baseline over time. So there are many ways for us to do that. For most cases, it's first of all, increasing overall activity, getting moving more often, even within a day, and then definitely within a week. We're going to want to include a good quality strength and conditioning program. That might be something that an individual has the ability to set up and to coordinate on their own. They might need to also partner with a good quality strength and conditioning coach or a clinician, like the ones we have at Parker University, especially Dr. Kirk. These people can help guide someone into the training regimens that are going to best benefit their activity level. But there's a lot of things that people can do on their own without needing instruction as well. And then lastly, and probably the one that's been missing from the picture even pre-COVID, is agility training. That dynamic, quick moving, kind of unpredictable play activity can really benefit these tendons and help us create more robustness.
So Dr. Dimak, I have a couple questions about your programs. You're the director of our master's degree in strength and human performance and our master's degree. Are your students being trained on how to prepare people to return to play?
Yes, absolutely. That return to sport or return to play, and there's different variations within those terms. That's a common discussion within the strength and conditioning community. So it is part of our curriculum in the master's program to introduce these principles and topics and then help either future clinicians or future coaches develop the skills they're going to need to help their future athletes, patients, or clients return to the sports that they love.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Dimak. I feel so blessed that we have these experts in strength and human performance and neurology and human performance and research here as resources here at Parker University as we try to uncover more about this hidden epidemic of Achilles tendon ruptures. Thank you for joining us.